Welcome to another episode of the Tom Schimmer Podcast. Happy Monday, everyone. Hope everyone had a great weekend. I have to say, as much as I love summer, I do love fall and what so many of us refer to as sweatshirt weather. Yes, I know fall doesn't officially begin until September 22nd, but let's face it, for the vast majority of educators, when you're back at work, it's fall. I'm also excited to be back on the road. As of July 7th, I've been traveling again, facilitating workshops in the United States. I've actually been to the United States several times back and forth since early July, and it feels good to be back to somewhat normal again. Zoom has been good, probably better than I had anticipated in terms of workshops, but there is nothing like the energy of being face-to-face. Fall also means football is back, and when football is back, that means fantasy football is back. And everyone in my 12-team league thinks they won the draft and loves their team. And then the first weekend happens, and reality sets in for the 6 teams that lost. So we'll see. I took a few chances this year. For the first time in 3 years, I did not keep Patrick Mahomes. I might regret that, but hey, I've never won the championship, so you have to try different strategies and different approaches. I also drafted Darren Waller, a tight end for the Raiders, in the second round, so he's been a beast, and I'm hoping that drafting a tight end that early doesn't come back to bite me. My quarterback this year is Baker Mayfield, and while I am not a Baker Mayfield fan, I do think he's poised to put up a fair number of fantasy points this year. So anyway, I'll keep you posted each week on the ups and downs of fantasy football. I know those of you who've been with me since the beginning, you lived those ups and downs last year, and we're going to do it again this year. Thanks again for listening in this week and sticking with me. And as always, a big welcome to any new listeners joining in for the first time. Your listening and following the podcast is greatly appreciated. And if you enjoy the podcast, please spread the word on social media or with your friends and colleagues. Today, my guest is Greg Wolcott. Greg is the author of Significant 72, Unleashing the Power of Relationships in Today's Schools, and that is exactly what we explore throughout our conversation. In Assessment Corner this week, I want to talk about assessment and grading reform and break it down in terms of the specific mindset or approaches when colleagues are along the continuums of willing and able in terms of their ability to manifest the change both individually and collectively. So that's today's plan. Let's get to it. We'll have my interview with Greg Wolcott coming up momentarily, but first, don't at me. But I want to open this week with a question about whether we, as a society collectively, whether we have become too serious. Now, this is probably more a think aloud than anything else, but it's something that's been on my mind for quite a while now. And I want to immediately draw a distinction between taking things seriously and becoming too serious. I think the former is important because it's about the cause, and the latter is self-indulgent and has us shifting the spotlight more to us than the issue. There are issues that need to be taken seriously. Racial equity, women's issues, indigenous rights, just to name a few. Those issues are serious and they require serious action. I think my issue is when people become the cause or become the issue. They go from taking an issue seriously to taking themselves too seriously, and then it becomes all about them. That was a line we weren't supposed to cross, but recently it feels as if everything is full throttle 24/7, and that letting up, or even, God forbid, lightening up for just a moment is met with the proverbial, well, I guess you don't really take that issue seriously now, do you? Now, you may have seen similar incidents or videos online that I have. Different videos of people out protesting or advocating on behalf of those who might not be able to advocate for themselves. They march down the street, they come across a person, and that person's just on their lunch break eating a Subway sandwich or something. And unsolicited, the advocates approach that person and try to convince them to join the cause. And when the person responds by saying, well, I don't think I can. I'm on my lunch break. I have to get back to work, but I'm with you. They get the onslaught of pressure tactics, I haven't seen this a lot, but I've seen a few of these videos where it's like, how can you eat at a time like this? There's no time like now to take up the cause. And if you really cared about this issue, you'd join us. And do you think just posting something on Facebook occasionally means you're an activist or bringing about real change? And the person is sitting there looking at this other person saying, like, look, bro, I'm all about the cause, but it's Thursday. It's a Thursday afternoon. Can I just eat my, 6-inch cold cut combo and get back to my cubicle this afternoon? My kid's got a baseball game tonight, and I'd like to not miss it. There has to be some downtime. We have to find the lighter moments in life. We have to be able to breathe. We have to be able to joke. We have to be able to joke with each other and not be so quick to be offended. Now, I'm not saying we should have permission to be offensive, but there does come a point where a person's intent has to be factored into how others respond. You can take issues seriously and still laugh. You can be all about a cause and still find the humor in situations. I notice this a fair amount in education. Our work is important. It's hard. And it needs to be taken seriously. And I do think sometimes a few educators can be guilty of not taking the work seriously enough. But there does come a point where we take ourselves too seriously and our work too seriously. And I know, this idea of taking yourself seriously, I know this is somewhat ironic coming from the guy who named his podcast after himself. I get it. I see it. But my own observation has me believing that the source of those taking themselves seriously is insecurity or uncertainty. It's insecurity in their positions or it's insecurity in themselves. So in that sense, observing or experiencing someone who takes themselves too seriously should be met with a little empathy. Not patronizing empathy, but an understanding that their inability to see the lighter side or the humor in even themselves or in their own positions is limiting them. Now, tomorrow is not promised to any of us. And I have seen and sadly experienced that kind of sudden loss in life. And I know that we can have all the plans we want, and then life throws you a curveball, and you have to reprioritize all over again. Life is serious, but it doesn't always have to be serious. I feel like confident people are able to laugh at themselves and their idiosyncrasies. I also wonder sometimes if the tendency to take ourselves too seriously is a product of age. Now, this is not another veiled shot at younger generations, okay? What I mean by this is that maybe we're prone to taking ourselves too seriously when we're younger because we want others to take us seriously, right? So when we are new to a school or new to the profession, or maybe when we get hired to teach at our former high school where there are several teachers who are still there and they remember us as a student, so we want them to see us as an adult. We want them to see us differently. And so maybe we have a tendency to be too serious at a younger age. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. I certainly have found that as I've aged, I have become more comfortable with who I am and more balanced in my perspective, that I can take things seriously, but avoid taking myself or life too seriously. Yes, look, there are so many issues literally around the world that we could immerse ourselves in. And given the access we have to information 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, these issues are in our face every single day. There are so many educational topics that we could immerse ourselves in, and you should, to a point. Not to the point where it consumes you and starts to undercut your happiness or your perspective. We can't control everything, and taking ourselves and life too seriously may be a sign that we're trying to do just that. I think not taking ourselves too seriously is actually a sign of self-acceptance, that we recognize our imperfections, and more importantly, we release perfection as a potential endpoint of our personal growth journeys. Perfection is not possible. So one of the things that I've recommitted to in my own personal journey is to not take myself or life too seriously, but emphasis on the two, right? Because life is serious. There are serious issues and serious circumstances that all of us face. For some of us, it's on occasion. And for others, the seriousness of life is relentless. And yet, in all of the seriousness of life, if we can find a way to see the big picture, find a way to remind ourselves that life in its totality is kind of ridiculous at times, it'll be good for our mental well-being. The irony for me, and maybe this is my biggest epiphany, is that by not taking myself and life too seriously, I feel like I'll have the energy and the mental bandwidth to take things more seriously, whether they be societal issues or my work. My worry is that we're already long down a societal path where the seriousness of life has consumed us collectively, and that this perfection we strive for or we think we see in others, especially on their social media profiles, we think perfection is the measuring stick. It feels like our collective seriousness is making us more unhappy than ever before. I don't know. Look, maybe I'm overthinking it. When the big stuff is serious, and there's no doubt the big stuff is serious, with COVID and all the other societal issues that have come to the surface over the past few years, with the seriousness of the big stuff, we have to find joy and humor in both the small stuff and in ourselves. So going forward, take things seriously without taking yourself too seriously. That's my new, or more specifically, my renewed mantra going forward.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
Joining me today for the interview is Greg Wolcott. Currently, Greg is an assistant superintendent for the Woodridge School District in Woodridge, Illinois, and that is a Chicago suburb. Greg is also the author of Significant 72, Unleashing the Power of Relationships in Today's Schools, and that is what our focus is going to be today as we have this conversation. So, Greg, welcome to the Tom Schimmer Podcast.
Hey, Tom, thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and talk a little about what I see as probably the most important thing in school, especially coming after COVID, and that's the relationships.
Absolutely. I've been looking forward to this conversation. You and I had a chance to connect a number of years ago at a conference, and we haven't connected in a while, but this is a great opportunity for us to reconnect and talk about what I know you believe is a really, really important aspect of school, maybe, as you said, the most important part. And it's great to have you here. Certainly the start of the school year is a great time to focus on building those relationships, and we are going to get to that momentarily. But before we dig into that Significant 72 and the power of relationships, Greg, let's start with you and the arc of your career. And maybe the impact points along that journey that led to you becoming an author, and also an advocate for the significance of teacher-student relationships.
I think, Tom, I think it kind of starts as a kid. A couple things. We moved around. I have three brothers, and we moved around a lot as a kid. And so I think I went to 9 or 10 schools during elementary, high school, middle school, nine schools in that period. So I was constantly, developing new relationships with teachers, new relationships with other kids. And I think that really impacted me in a positive way, is when I had those teachers that were empowering, and who helped me believe a little bit more in myself. And there was definitely a difference between some teachers and others. And so I think that kind of started things. Then my dad became an elementary school principal, and seeing and being involved a little bit more from an education and, in his schools just gave me a different perspective. And so then I started, played some sports in college, and we would do some basketball camps and with young kids. And that just kind of led to that, pursuit then of becoming an elementary teacher, and then elementary principal, then district office, and then I started teaching grad classes, and one of the classes I taught predominantly was an action research class. And in this action research class, it was all about identifying a challenge you have in your classroom, reading some research about that, and then coming up with an intervention that you would put into place. And what I saw pretty quickly is about 50% of my grad students were putting in interventions to do their action research that were around classroom management, around discipline, around relationship building. And so it became, wow, this is, a bigger deal. And I still remember one girl, Nikki, who was in one of my classes, and she started her intervention was specifically around building relationships and doing what I talk about in my book, which is called the 2x4, where you take 2 minutes a day with 4 different kids and just get to know them. And when it came time to share her research with the class, she just kind of broke down in tears. And she said, my cooperating teacher said not to be kids' friends, that I had to stay strong, and that I had to be the disciplinarian. And she said, boy, through this research did I see how wrong that was, and how much I missed out. So I think those are those are the big impact points for me, and what really got me into, all right, let's listen, 50% of the grad students, focusing on disciplinary things and relationship building things, and feedback issues around relationships. Probably better take a little deeper dive. And so that's when I became really started to dive a lot deeper into it.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting when you talked about how much you had moved as a young child yourself. It makes me wonder whether or not we as educators, not with any kind of malice or intent, but do we sometimes underestimate the impact of being new and the importance of trying to find our way in a new environment and build those relationships. Do you think that happens sometimes, Greg? Do you think we sometimes underestimate the impact of what it's like to be the new student in a school?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think, we are so quickly worried about, I think as educators, I think I did this at times, is I was so worried about just getting the child in and getting them into the routines, and maybe figuring out what their academic needs are, that I don't think I spent as much time as I probably needed to, now looking back on it. And so I think that's one of the things that we've really pushed is, what are those, what are your welcome routines for kids that move in during the year? How are we going to intentionally build that teacher-student relationship, especially as it gets to middle school and high school?
Yeah, I like I said, I don't think it comes from any position of intent.
No.
It's just we're so busy and we're wanting to get on with the school year, and we're excited about the school year, and we have some new students, and we want to get going with our work. The other thing that struck me as you were talking about that action research project was this continual idea of this false dichotomy that you can't be a so-called disciplinarian, or you can't have structure, and it's either structure or you have relationships, that you can't have both. And I just think we continue. And I think that's going to be a bit of our focus as we continue our conversation, because I think you can do both. You can have a structured environment. You can have predictability in terms of how students feel in terms of the routines, and yet you can have strong relationships with those students. So let's jump into Significance 72, and let's ask the question, why 72? What is the significance of 72, and where did that come from?
Yeah, so as I was teaching those graduate classes, John Hattie came out with his book, Visible Learning. And so as I'm teaching classes, that book came out, so it became a natural to incorporate into the class. And I started really paying attention to, I kind of followed this process that, every group of students that I would have, I would research a different topic in depth. So as they're going through their action research project, I wanted to make it authentic, so I was going through it with them. And so, one group was all on teacher-student feedback. And so, that's what I dove into for that 8-week period. Another time it was micro teaching. A third time it was the relationships. And so I would dive into that aspect of Hattie's research. And at that point, his book had just come out, and the effect size of teacher-student relationships was 0.72. Which in essence means 2 years growth in 1 year's time, academic time. And through that, then it led me to see, wow, at middle school and high school, that effect size was actually stronger at the middle school and high school age. And so that's really what got me going in it. And it caused me to dive a little bit deeper. Hattie's research has since changed. He added a huge meta-analysis from Korea with preschool kids that kind of changed the impact to 0.55. But, the 72 comes from that. And because I think that's pretty significant, that those relationships have that large an impact.
I think sometimes we can get caught up in the numbers and the rankings and just realize that there are certain things that we do that just have a significant impact. And whether it's 0.72 or 0.55, what we're really saying, what Hattie is really saying, and what others we know, but it's nice to have the support behind it, which is that strong teacher-student relationships has a significant impact on student learning. So,
Right.
at this point in the year, most schools, of course, have already started. They're already in session. But I know that you advocate for schools beginning the school year by setting aside those first 72 hours. There's that number again. Those first 3 days to begin developing not just the student-teacher relationships, but the student to student relationship. So, why do you think, from your perspective, is it so important for educators to be that purposeful at the beginning of the school year?
Well, I think it starts by, we have to develop that psychological, not just the relationship, but the atmosphere of psychological safety in the classroom. At the essence of every relationship, great relationship is a sense of attachment with someone, and that sense of attachment really is that I have your unconditional love, your unconditional support, that you care about me as much about me as a child as you do a student, and that even if I fail in this classroom academically, you're not going to look at me as a failure, and that starting to develop that then creates that environment where mistakes are okay. If I believe you feel that way about me, if I believe and start having these connections with my kid, with my classmates, if I start feeling that, then again, I feel I can make mistakes. I feel that I can be my true self in that environment. And so it starts with those first 3 days. How are we right away going to do that? And then, over the course of the year, weekly, every day, how can we spend 72 seconds on relationship builders? And we've had some incredible results, teachers getting rid of bell ringers and replacing them with connection creators, because as kids come in, instead of the stress of jumping right into a bell ringer, let's get the kids, get their brain aligned and ready to go with some type of connection creator that so they feel that bond. And so it's all about that intentionality.
I was just going to ask you about, you talk about eliminating those bell ringers. And I think so much of what we've done historically or traditionally has been well intended, right? There's good
Yes.
intentions behind the bell ringers, and we understand the
Oh
noble
yeah.
cause of trying to do that. But we also recognize the stress and anxiety that can create. And that doesn't put you in a position, because we know that anxiety interferes with brain function, it interferes with your memory, your ability to pay attention, and all of that. So, as well intentioned as those bell ringers might be, I love the idea of a connection creator. What are some other strategies? What are some things, even though the school year has started, there may be teachers out there thinking to themselves, okay, I didn't start the first 3 days with relationship building, but I want to circle back. It's early enough in the school year. They probably have more of a relationship right now. But what are some other things that teachers can do to try to forge those solid bonds with their students?
Well, uh, one of them is, I think one of the things I turn to a lot is, um, is self-disclosure. Self-disclosure is us sharing things about ourselves, and so I think teachers underestimate, especially as kids get older, how, when we share things about ourselves, what we did over a weekend, where we went to college, our first job, those things, that self-disclosure goes a long way. And starts, we don't let people into our life unless we care about them. So when we share those things, it sends that message. So I think, the more we can do that, the more we can model vulnerability. I think the number one thing that that the work has kind of proven is we have to be vulnerable with our students and let them see that. And Brene Brown writes a ton about vulnerability, and she talks in one of her books about trust as a marble jar, and every time you're vulnerable, you add a marble to that trust jar. And so I think for teachers, I think those are some of the quick strategies. How can I be vulnerable? How can I be vulnerable, because I'm building that trust? How can I do like that grad student of mine, this 2x4 relationship? where I'm going to spend 2 minutes a day with 4 different kids just getting to know them. Or if I'm at a middle school, high school teacher, a 1x4, I'm going to spend 1 minute a day with 4 different kids and just connect eye to eye with them, and get to know them. I think those are the simple things that can be done daily that we've seen just have a huge impact.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. My follow-up was going to be, how important is it for us to model vulnerability?
Mm.
And you took that word right out of my mouth. And I think what I really appreciate about the 2x4 strategy, or any strategies like that, is 2 things. One, it's very purposeful and predictable for the teachers to methodically and purposefully go about building those relationships. And it also is an answer to the question of, Greg, what am I supposed to do when I have 120 or 150 students on my rosters every day? How do I build relationships with all of them? Well, you build them 4 students at a time, right? You connect with them in that way. I want you to take some time and walk us through what you call the CAP matrix. Because I thought this was a very clever way to look at the balance between care and academic press. And by the way, I absolutely love that expression, academic press.
Yeah.
So our relationships, of course, need to find the balance between academic press and care, and sometimes they do not. So explore that with us. Help us understand what you mean by the CAP matrix, and some of maybe the missteps that we may come across.
Yeah. So basically, when I was teaching my grad students, I started surveying them who was the best teacher they ever had. Not their favorite teacher, who was their best teacher. And as I started doing that, there were 2 huge trends that all of those great teachers had: high levels of care and high levels of press. And so, when we look back and your listeners, our listeners, can look back and think of those great teachers, and what did they do differently? Well, they cared about me, they cared about my growth, but they pushed me hard. And so it had to be the 2 pieces. And so basically then, if we kind of use those as, if we kind of use that as our guidepost, or and those 2 pieces as our cornerstone, we can kind of create this matrix of high levels of care or low levels of care, high levels of press or low levels of press. And press being a little different than expectations. We can say we have high expectations, but do students feel that? And I think that's the difference with academic press. Academic press is, I feel as the student pressed by you as my teacher to succeed. And so, we can then make a matrix of 4 different type of teachers. And so low press, low care is Wanda, whatever, doesn't really care what's going on in your class, right? And we don't have that many people. High press, low care is kind of Dan the drill sergeant. We've all can think back of who that teacher is. High care and low press, I call Chris the camp counselor. And we can think of that classroom. You and I talked about our friend Tom Herrick, and Tom and I were sitting together one day and talking about that teacher is kind of the cotton candy classroom. Where, that teacher wants to be your friend. It's kind of like when I eat cotton candy. I love cotton candy, but a half hour later, I don't remember I ate anything. And that's what can happen in that teacher's class. It's all about fun, but they're really not learning anything. Right. And then the pinnacle then is that high press, high care. And that's where grit, perseverance are developed. That's where academic achievement, love of learning, can only be achieved in that classroom. Right. Self-esteem can only be achieved in that classroom, where you're being challenged and pushed. And while you're being challenged and pushed, you're being supported at the same time.
That speaks to that false dichotomy we talked about earlier. It speaks to why coaches often have such great relationships with their athletes, and they push them. And yet they are able to develop those deep relationships. And it's interesting because I'm certain you've had a similar experience. But throughout the course of my career, one of the things that I've learned is that to be demanding and have that press without being punitive is one of the lessons I've learned over the course. And ironically, or not ironically, but I suppose ironic to some people, would be the fact that as I learned to transition away from that connection to be tough or demanding and press without being punitive, your relationships deepen with those students and you have a stronger connection with them, because there is nothing there is nothing that speaks to the relationship of a teacher and a student when the teacher looks at the student and says, I know you can do it. I believe that you can reach high levels of intellectual performance. That to me says that a huge part, plays a huge part, I should say, in how deep those relationships go. So I want to ask you about repairing relationships, because obviously we want things to go perfectly and we want them to go well, but what about a situation where a teacher has, for example, lost their patience or acted emotionally or said or did something that damaged the relationship with the student? And of course, I'm not talking here about crossing any serious lines. I'm just
Right.
talking about a moment where the teacher has handled things poorly and the relationship has been significantly impacted. What's the approach? How do we reconcile that? How do we bring that relationship back?
Well, I think there's two parts to that that we see play out, and that is, obviously the first part with the individual student, but a lot of times when that conflict arises, other students in the classroom are aware of it, and so I think it's important when we think of the other kids in the classroom that kids only feel as safe in the classroom as the worst behaving child is treated. So if you misbehave and you and I have this relationship problem, but it is out in the public where everyone sees that. If I'm, for example, if I yell at you, Tom, come on, get your act together. That we just jeopardize the safety with all kids in the class. And they're now going to wonder, okay, if he can yell at Tom, is he going to yell at me? So there's a repair aspect with the whole class that has to happen by me saying, you know what, hey class, I lost my cool. This wasn't acceptable, and I shouldn't have done that. So I think there's that aspect. The other aspect is, all right, now with Tom, how do I reconnect with Tom? And that's where I think those purposeful one-on-one conversations are, and the fact that we have to reconnect. I think the next piece with it then is, kind of like that movie, 50 First Dates. I don't know if you ever saw that with Adam Sandler, where the girl he was dating had amnesia, and every day he had to date her again. I think that's what we have to do as teachers. I think great teachers have amnesia when it comes to challenging students. Every day is a fresh start. Every day is a fresh start. Yeah. And when we give kids a fresh start, we can then ask for a fresh start ourselves. And so, kind of building that back one day at a time, one day at a time.
Speaks to that vulnerability, doesn't it? In terms of coming in the next day and saying, look, I blew it yesterday. That was my fault. I overreacted. And again, as the only adult in the room, we do have to take a disproportionate amount of the responsibility. Yeah. Certainly relationships take two people, but as the adult in the room, we have to really take that responsibility to say, I'm going to reach out. How do we make sure, like what we have to remind ourselves, don't we? Maybe comment a little bit on this. I just wonder, sometimes we want to repair the relationship, but that doesn't happen overnight. So there are times where we may have to be patient with the students. Would you agree with that? That sometimes we have to be patient. They're not going to come around the next day just because you've apologized. That doesn't mean the relationship is 100% repaired, is it?
No, and I think it goes, let's go back to that trust is a marble jar. When I just broke that marble jar and I got to start all over. Right. So I've got to rebuild it a little at a time, and we have to, forgive ourselves. Hey, we're all human. It's part of the human experience to have those days that are up and down. We're going to have those days. The key is to make sure the child knows at the end of the day, I do care about you, and I'm here to help you succeed, and not weigh too much on it ourselves. I think sometimes we see teachers who will have a day like that, and they feel that, I can never repair it.
Right.
And then they give up instead of saying, you know what, it's repairable. It's just going to take time.
Just building that trust back, right? Yeah. Because when that trust is broken, many of the students who struggle with relationships with adults, it's that trust issue, and being vulnerable and owning our mistakes. there's often adults in their lives who have never owned up to their mistakes and
Right.
owned up to their responsibility for the damaged relationships that they have in other aspects of their lives. So that modeling to me is, again, it comes back to that modeling. It comes back to being vulnerable, building that trust back up. And I think you're absolutely spot on when you say, look, it's going to take some time. We smashed the jar. We've got to repair that jar, and we've got to start adding marbles back into that. Before we finish up today, Greg, any advice for teachers? Again, we've talked a little bit about this, but just, how do we any other advice for nurturing strong relationships, things we can do to establish those relationships? What are some pieces of advice where maybe for new teachers or others who are just thinking about how do I go about sort of connecting with students when maybe those types of connections aren't always my forte as an adult, as a person? Any thoughts, advice for teachers?
I think, again, just those little things like those connection creators really start. But if we're not as comfortable with that, and maybe we're coming at it more from that drill sergeant end, how can we change? How can we change just some of the phrasing of how we do things, and preface why we're doing things with a sense of care. Tom, I'm pushing you hard today because I feel you're capable of achieving at high levels. If I didn't think you were capable of achieving at high levels, I'd give you something easy. Just that simple message is empowering as opposed to and shows a level of care. So even if we start changing some of the words like that in our phrases and things like that, we can start sending that message. I think, again, just that, kind of connecting back to times where we didn't have that relationship and what our achievement could have been had we been that way.
Yeah.
And not only with the teacher, but the group, and so I think one of the things that we're seeing a lot of impact is from right now is when teachers start thinking of that social risk that students take in the classroom, when they raise a hand or things like that, we can put ourselves back in a position when we didn't do as well because of the social risk in the environment, and that if the relationships were better in the environment, we probably would have taken a little social risk and therefore achieved at a higher level. Right. And so let's connect back to that and really build that relationships amongst the classroom.
Yeah, that connection makes me think about at least beginning to know your students as learners and what sort of connects with them as far as the learning. You may hesitate to be vulnerable with them in terms of your private life. Not that you have to share the deepest, right, darkest secrets, but you may not want. There are some teachers who aren't comfortable sharing anything personal.
Right.
But one way that it makes me think about building relationships with students by starting with knowing them as learners and what inspires them and what they're curious about, and how to connect with them that way.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why those one-on-one conversations are so key.
Right. That to me is, and the other part, again, coming right back to what we talked about earlier, those 2x4 strategies for those who are uncomfortable with, stepping out and being a little bit vulnerable. Those types of predictable systems or structures or routines can help create a kind of opportunity for me to build relationships in a way that's a little bit more methodical and purposeful, and that actually helps me break out of my own comfort zone.
Exactly.
So 2 questions, Greg, as we finish up. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. 2 general questions I'm going to finish up with you today. And the first one is educationally focused, and you can take this in any direction you want. But educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
I think the piece that keeps me up right now is, maybe under the umbrella of staffing and future staffing. And, number one being the stress, I think under that kind of the stress level of what educators are facing, and some of the challenges that educators have. I think the fact that fewer people are going into the profession, at least here in the United States. We used to put out a job application and have 300 people by the end of the day for a elementary school position. Now we're lucky if we have 30 after 2 weeks, so I think that's what keeps me up at night, and that how might we help people see the great value in being an educator. Yeah. And how do we help those that are involved and already in education want to stay in it, and how might we help them reconnect with why they went into the profession in the first place? Yeah. And that's another reason why I think I push the relationship so hard is that's why we got in it, and teachers that say, wow, okay, you forced me to do those 2x4 conversations, but you know what? That was a highlight of my day. Yeah. And I can't wait for tomorrow to have the 2x4 conversations with the next group of kids. Right. And so how do we keep educators in the game?
It's
mentally and physically.
Absolutely. It's a education and educators are an easy target and often take it on the chin from society. And, I don't really know what the answer to that is, other than the fact that we have to find a way to reverse that, because those who connect to the profession, those who are in the profession, know how incredibly rewarding it is. And yet for so many, they've just lost interest in a profession that I think there's a bit of mythology around, the profession and the idea that, the way that society talks about educators and teachers, we have to find a way to reverse that. This is the last question for today, Greg. It's a question I ask everyone I interview, and it really is a question about success and happiness. And the question really is quite simple, is whether it's personal or professional, and I'll let you take this wherever you want to. What is your definition of success?
I think my definition of success is really having the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to kind of navigate all the obstacles and opportunities that life brings forward. Do I have I think success is having that knowledge, the skills, and the attitudes, using our strengths that we each individually have, to handle everything that comes our way. That to me is success. Is can I handle everything? Do I have we're gonna have a bad day, but do I have some strategies that I know how to combat after a bad day? Do I have an attitude that, hey, I realize, okay, again, 51st dates, so we're gonna start again tomorrow.
Yeah. For sure. The idea that I continue to grow, I learn from my mistakes, and I continue to have the strength and resiliency to navigate through all the twists and turns that life brings us, for sure. Listeners, you can and should follow Greg on Twitter. His Twitter handle is @GregJ.Wolcott. Same handle on Instagram as well. That's @GregJ.Wolcott. And you can find Greg on LinkedIn as well. Just search Greg Wolcott, and we'll put links in the show notes for all of those accounts. Also, check out Greg's website, www.drivelearning.org. You're going to find a ton of tools there, resources, and information about Significant 72, as well as contact information for Greg, should you be interested in having Greg speak to your school or to your district. Greg, really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. Thanks so much.
Hey, Tom, appreciate it, and honored and humbled for the opportunity. Thank you.
In Assessment Corner this week, I want to focus on assessment and grading reform efforts. Specifically, a question I've received a lot over the summer and even into the spring in many of the workshops and trainings I've been conducting. And it's the question that centers around, like, Tom, how do we know where to begin? Or what should our focus be when, our faculty is in a particular place? And so to answer that question when it comes to me, I often ask leaders or early adopters to think about how willing and how capable they think their colleagues are when it comes to implementing the desired change. So that cross-section between sort of the willing and unwilling and the capable and incapable creates 4 scenarios that actually can serve, I think, as a fairly good general guideline for how to proceed. Now, you can think of these scenarios as either this is where the majority of our faculty is, and that might drive efforts collectively, but you can also think about them as individuals. If we have individuals in these particular scenarios, how might we proceed with them, again, individually? So let's take a look at each of those 4 potential combinations. The first one is probably the easiest one to deal with. It's the combination of willing and able. You've got a faculty collectively who are willing to move ahead with the proposed changes to assessment and grading, and they have the capacity to move ahead with the proposed changes on assessment and grading. So here's where you just want to move ahead with your implementation plan. Whatever plan you've put together, whatever you want to address. So for example, if you've decided that you want to address the assessment issues and look at formative assessment and begin to engineer more important feedback routines and start to shape the unpacking of standards and how we design our assessments, moving ahead toward grading. If that's your plan, then go for it. If your plan is to address grading first and begin to take away some of the egregious practices and then begin to work sort of backwards into the formative realm and talk about feedback, etc., if that's your plan, go ahead and do it. The bottom line is, if your colleagues are willing and capable of moving ahead with the plan, then just move ahead with the plan. The second combination is still the willing, but now we have those who are incapable or unable to move ahead with the plan as it stands. Now, to be clear, the idea of being incapable doesn't mean they're incompetent. It just means right now they might lack the capacity or the fluency or the understanding of what the practices entail. So here's a scenario, the willing and incapable. Here's a scenario where we'll probably be pretty focused on increasing opportunities for, expanding their knowledge. So this could be in the form of book studies, conferences, online events, articles, different experiences that help grow their knowledge in what assessment looks like. But also, these are folks who probably need some practice with the new approaches to assessment and grading that are proposed in our implementation plan. So again, here's where coaching comes in, right? These are people who need to grow their knowledge and practice a little bit, maybe with some guidance, maybe with some advice from the early adopters. They're willing to move ahead with the change. They just might not understand what that change is supposed to look like. And so that coaching can be very helpful for them. Now we move to the other scenarios. And the other 2 scenarios are a little bit tougher because when you have the combination of unwilling but capable, that can be frustrating as a leader or as an implementer or as a change agent, because you know that there is a collective capacity to move ahead with the plan. It just seems that people are resistant or hesitant. And with that hesitancy now, what I would think about is tailoring the implementation efforts to focus on what I might call low effort and high yield practices, or where you get the minimal amount of resistance. So low effort, high yield practices might be something that this group of individuals, let's say the faculty is unwilling but capable. Try to find areas where they're already doing it, or there's some semblance of what you're proposing already in place, and therefore they can capitalize on that. So therefore it would require low effort for them to implement something because they've got most of it in place already. They may not realize that they're doing it, but the high yield comes from the refinement, right? So the refinement happens and suddenly they go from good to great, and they realize that they already had some of these things in place. It was pretty seamless to make that change. So target those areas. Look where there's, again, to use the expression, low effort but high yield practices. Or it might be wise to think about, okay, I realize you're hesitant, but is there one aspect of our proposed change that you find most agreeable, or that is closest to what you're already doing, or it's something you find the least resistance to? Even solicit their information, from them, and just say, where can we begin this process? And so see where you get minimal resistance. This is probably where you're going to implement, sort of with the eye on that cliche that says, think big, start small. But the unwilling but capable, that can be frustrating because, like I said earlier, they have the capacity to do it, but they're just resistance for some reason. And obviously in this scenario, you want to find out why. Why the lack of willingness? What is the source of that? Why are you unwilling to move ahead? Now, the last one, where you have the unwilling and the incapable. Okay, they're not willing to change. They don't really know what the change looks like, and that might be a frustration. If the collective staff and faculty is in the place where they're unwilling to make that change, and maybe they lack the capacity to make the change, then I think we need to modify our plan and have the plan focus on exploration. As opposed to having a definitive plan that says, here's what we're going to do over the next 6 months, or here's what we're going to do over this school year, or here's where we want to be in the next 3 years. Back off a little bit and build a plan, or construct a strategy that says, we're just going to explore these ideas. We want to see if any of these ideas are actually suitable for our school. So we're going to take our time, because you're better to get it right than to rush into something that folks, in both cases, they aren't willing to budge, and it's clear they don't have the capacity to make that move either. So that's a tough one for sure as well. I think either scenario with the unwilling is a tough one, but the unwilling and the incapable, build a sort of slow release, like it's a very gradual plan of thinking about, all right, let's get this right. Let's do a little exploration. Let's think about how we can expose people to some content in a very controlled way, without giving the impression that there's a hidden agenda, or without giving the impression that we're trying to rush anything. We're not trying to overwhelm people. And again, the question of unwilling, you always want to ask the question, why? What is the source of the resistance? What is it that's not working for you? So here we might say, let's just read an article. Let's do a book study. Let's go to a conference, and let's just see if there's something there for us. So in that scenario, that is a tough one. But like I said, if you combine the willing and unwilling with the capable and incapable, those 4 scenarios really do give you a nice point of entry, or a nice guideline. Now, of course, as I said, that can be an examination of the whole faculty. Chances are, in your school, if it's large enough, chances are you've got people at every one of those phases, or in every one of those quadrants, if you will, right? So you build your plan. So ask yourself, where's the majority? And now think about those individuals, right? Because it's the individuals where you're going to support them in moving them forward individually, right? So pay attention to that both collectively, but also individually, because the most effective implementation plans are the ones that bring the ones that bring about long-term change. The most effective plans are the ones that are attentive to the context. That's why there's really no definitive answer to the step-by-step process of how do we bring about assessment and grading reform. Pay attention to the context. Where should we begin? Well, where are you now, both collectively and individually? That's going to dictate what the most favorable course of action is going forward. All right, that's it for this week. Remember to follow the podcast on Twitter for updates. That's @TomSchimmerPod. You can follow me on Twitter as well, @TomSchimmer. Shimmer Education on Facebook, @TomSchimmerPodcast on Instagram. And don't forget about the YouTube channel as well, Tom Schimmer Podcast on YouTube. Also, please email your questions for Assessment Corner, or any podcast suggestions you have. Maybe you've got some suggestions for guests. Email tomschimmerpod@gmail.com. Next week, my guest will be author and speaker Rachel Carrillo-Fairchild. Our focus will be on how we support English language learners, so you won't want to miss that one. Rachel is fantastic, and her expertise is inspiring. Please subscribe, follow, rate, review the podcast, especially on Apple Podcasts, of course. And if you like the podcast, please continue to spread the word about the podcast on social media or with your friends and colleagues. I would really appreciate that. Have a great week, everyone.